Amenaza nuclear absoluta. Rusia advierte a Donald Trump que borrará todo si Estados Unidos de América sigue con su plan de los misiles Tomahawk. Esto es lo que está sucediendo ahora mismo y cuidado porque María Zakharova ha enviado un claro comunicado en el que ella no lo permitirá. Sobre todo, ya lo ha dicho, Estados Unidos tenga muy en cuenta que no vamos a tolerar esta misiva. Rusia, por lo tanto, quiere cortar toda relación con los Estados Unidos de América si los Tomahawks entran en Kiev. Esto significa que las embajadas, los consulados, los diplomáticos, entre otras cosas, dejarán de movilizarse en los Estados Unidos. Y cuidado con este tema, mucho cuidado con este tema, porque el Kremlin ya ha garantizado que y después de este avión RC, espía, por cierto, que ha sido movilizado a Kaliningrado desde el este de Inglaterra, donde solo Yoff y los presentadores de televisión ya han corroborado que tendrían que hacer desaparecer la isla de Inglaterra. Atención con el comunicado de María Zakharova. Esto es lo que ha estado indicando el día de hoy, día 9 de octubre. Vamos a ver qué es lo que comunica. Atención.
As a result of shelling by the Ukrainian armed forces, the overhead power line of the Dnipropetrovsk gas station was damaged.
Por cierto, hay que tener en cuenta que esto es traducción de inteligencia artificial, no está hablando en inglés. Esto hay que tenerlo en cuenta, pero todo lo que está diciendo en ruso está bien traducido al inglés para que lo entendamos mejor. Y abajo también tenemos la traducción en español.
This led to the cessation of external power supply to the station. By covering up such terrorist acts of the Kyiv regime, the countries of the European Union and NATO not only encourage Ukraine to carry out new attacks on peaceful nuclear facilities, but also become their direct accomplices. Does not cease its attempts to find additional resources to keep the Zelensky regime afloat. This task was one of the central items on the agenda of the informal EU summit held on October 1st in Copenhagen. Brussels intends to solve it at the expense of so-called frozen Russian sovereign assets. According to the European Commission's plan, funds amounting to 140 billion euros are to be allocated to Bankova as a gratuitous grant, an interest-free loan which it, meaning the Kyiv regime, will hardly, if ever, repay. Why? Because the main condition for repayment is an absolutely unrealistic demand for, as it was stated, Russia to pay some kind of reparations to Ukraine. But in the upside-down world in which the European Union and NATO live, perhaps that's exactly how it is. But we live in reality.
Esto, por cierto, se dijo, lo estuvimos comentando también en el programa. Es muy curioso porque, claro, María Zakharova ya no se calla. Dice, hombre, pero es que nos están pidiendo reparaciones a nosotros de guerra cuando nosotros estamos ganando la batalla, la guerra. Claro, dice, esto está en las fantasías y en las tonterías, dice María Zakharova, de Europa, porque Europa tiene que entender que cuando se pagan reparaciones es cuando pierdes la guerra, no cuando la estás ganando, precisamente.
And we know that Brussels has long been actively engaged in stealing the income from frozen Russian assets. They come up with all sorts of justifications, invent different formulas. Now they've come up with some kind of reparation. But the essence is always the same: to start stealing Russian sovereign assets. Since 2022, the European Union has, so to speak, helped Ukraine to the tune of 178 billion euros. How many civilians of various nationalities and different citizenships living in these territories have been killed for this? For some reason, the European Union doesn't mention that. 63 billion accounts for direct military assistance. At the EU summit in Copenhagen on October 1st, European leaders once again demonstrated that their response to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine includes not diplomacy, but escalation. End of quote. Yes, that's exactly right. Because now, even among the ranks of Euro diplomats, there are either outright schemers and swindlers, people for whom even the justice system of the European Union itself is calling out. Or they are complete amateurs, people who have no idea what diplomacy actually is. Precisely so that no questions are asked. Contrary to logic and facts, he claimed that supporting Kyiv is, in his words, support for peace, not war. But how does that make any sense? The money goes directly to the war and the rhetoric is aggressive. Yet everyone hides behind the word peace. He called for continued military, political, and economic assistance to the Kyiv regime and urged mobilization to strengthen, and I quote, collective European defense in the face of what he called the Russian threat. Well, first they invented this so-called Russian threat, plastered it all over their corridors and meeting rooms like wallpaper, and then they make decisions about strengthening some sort of collective European security. Ukrainian social media is actively discussing the issue of the authorities' intention to recruit about 1.5 million people into the armed forces of Ukraine in the near future. Who will these people be? They will be citizens of Ukraine. Of what age? In what condition? I mean, what about their health? No one will care about that. No one will be concerned. They'll be thrown into the meat grinder of this very Western hell that they are creating on the territory of Ukraine with Zelensky's hands. We are out.
Bueno, esto es una pena, ¿no? Sobre todo porque cuando hablamos de... Bueno, prácticamente es lo que dice. ¿Quién va a ir a la guerra? ¿Quién va a ir a la guerra? 1,5 millones, por cierto, dice María Zakharova, que quieren lanzar a los combates. 1,5 millones de nuevos reclutas. María Zakharova, claro, dice, es que es un país muy pequeño, Ucrania. Entonces, ¿quién va a ir a la guerra? Claro, gente que no tenga la salud muy buena, niños, bueno, jóvenes. A ver, yo sí digo, ¿no? Porque yo conozco muchos ucranianos, ¿no? Que viven aquí en Estados Unidos, en Washington hay muchos, y siempre les digo, mira, qué suerte, ¿no? Porque qué suerte que no estáis ahí, porque es que al final lo que a mí me preocupa que estos amigos míos, que son además muy cercanos, ucranianos, rusos también, tengo muchos amigos, que digo, ostras, pues qué bien que estáis aquí, ¿no? Y ojalá os podáis quedar toda la vida, porque es que al final Ucrania o Rusia, no se sabe esto, porque si la guerra dura más años, ¿no? Imaginaros que dura años, les estarían obligando también a volver. O sea, estamos hablando ya de una locura tan grande que nosotros siempre lo hemos dicho, no sé lo que opinaréis vosotros, pero ¿por qué no coge Putin y Zelensky y a mí me encantaría que así se terminase la guerra? Putin y Zelensky en un ring de boxeo. Punto. Punto. Quien gane, gana la guerra. Así es como se hacían las guerras antiguamente. Esto lo hemos dicho muchas veces. En la antigua Macedonia, en Grecia, en Troya, Héctor contra Aquiles. ¿Por qué ahora las guerras están enviando a niños, están enviando a ancianos? ¿Por qué? Y lo triste que esto se acepta, ¿no? Vamos a escuchar.
Outraged by the blatant manifestations of Russophobia. The Australian authorities have refused to issue entry visas to members of the Roscosmos State Corporation delegation led by Director General Dmitry Bakhanov. They were heading there to participate in the 76th International Astronautical Congress IAC Sydney from September 29th to October 3rd. This event was supposed to take place. We are witnessing yet another unfriendly act, which reflects Canberra's blind adherence to the short-sighted and reckless campaign of the collective West, which is unsuccessfully trying to implement the concept of isolating our country. They can't succeed, but at least they want to cause trouble. The politicians of Western countries in recent decades, despite their proclaimed openness, are by no means as open as they claim to be. As they declare, well, try it, that's a good question. Why? Just look at how interesting it is, how everything comes together for them in such a remarkable way. On the one hand, they almost start writing memoirs. Take, for example, the former German Foreign Minister Baerbock, who has already managed to publish her memoirs, barely stepping away from her desk, you see. On the other hand, the most important facts needed for decision-making, for the possibility of avoiding escalation or an open phase of conflict, are kept silent. That's an excellent question. Let's address it to all of them. And why did Merkel stay silent? And why are they publishing, Baerbock in particular, memoirs when they should be working instead of doing that? Instead of, I don't know, self-aggrandizement. Why? That's a good question. I'd also like to know the answer to it. What else will she talk about, or what else can she share on the stated topic? This is a huge list of questions that we have, and we've actually asked them. The most interesting one: what happened with the Berlin patient? And by the way, how did she feel after visiting him? In the ward? The president of Russia has clearly stated our position on such dangerous steps in case they are carried out. And despite the fact that we have significantly improved our missile defense system, cruise missiles are a powerful weapon, and if the Kyiv regime acquires them, it will lead to a new serious stage of escalation in the Ukrainian crisis. Of course, none of this will affect the balance of power on the battlefield. The issue is not so much that Tomahawks will end up at the disposal of the Ukrainian armed forces, but that their use comes at no cost. Direct involvement of American military personnel is simply impossible. Once again, the Russian leadership has repeatedly spoken about this. The corresponding decisions by the US administration, I repeat, if ultimately made, are not only fraught with escalating the spiral of confrontation, but will also cause irreparable damage to Russian-American relations, which have only just begun to show signs of renewal, of an outside dialogue. We are closely monitoring the development of the situation around this issue and urge the utmost restraint in dealing with this highly sensitive topic, which could significantly complicate efforts to find solutions on the Ukrainian track.
Ahí lo tenemos, ya lo dice. Si se envían Tomahawks, muy interesante lo que ha dicho María Zakharova, podrían haber problemas de relaciones, cerrar embajadas, entre otras cosas. Dejad en los comentarios qué es lo que opináis. Nos vemos en el próximo capítulo, amigos. Hasta luego.